From a purely biological perspective, human life does not begin at conception. Life continues at conception. It's the ongoing transmission of a biological legacy that already exists within the parents and stretches back through countless generations.
America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Welcome to the Liberty Brief. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and today we have a truly fascinating conversation lined up. We're joined by Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the recently released book, An Unbroken Stream, Uniquely Reframing Life, Rights, and Personhood for the Abortion Debate. And with that, we're going to welcome Dr. Tom back onto the show.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's always a pleasure.
Now, Dr. Tom, let's get into this. Your book takes what you call a uniquely different approach to the abortion debate. And I've read this book and I found it fascinating. I've never seen anything quite so eloquently posited, one that frames it in a way that I've never, ever seen before. This one is grounded in natural law and biology rather than politics or, say, religion. But before we dive into The Unbroken Stream, I understand this book actually sparked something much larger, for you at least, and you've got another book coming out soon called The Sovereign Self. And it was a consequence of writing this first book that brought you to the second. Can you just give us a little bit of a hint about what we'll be talking about in the next podcast?
Absolutely, sure. When I finished writing The Unbroken Stream, I thought I'd made the case I needed to make that human personhood isn't a legal status granted by the state, but a natural reality that precedes all institutions. But as the book went to press, I realized I'd only answered half the question. I defended the principle of natural personhood, but I hadn't provided a way to see when it's being eroded across other contexts. The abortion debate revealed a universal pattern. Systems constantly redefine personhood to suit their purposes. And that realization led me to write The Sovereign Self, which is the next book that's coming out.
Okay, so we're really talking about personhood, which is a facet of natural law. So let's start with that foundation. Your book challenges the very question that dominates the abortion debate. When does life begin? You argue that that's the wrong question entirely. Why?
Well, the question, when does life begin, is a strategic misdirection. It forces us all into an arbitrary, event-based timeline like conception, heartbeat, viability, live birth, that are more suited to legal contracts than biological reality. From a purely biological perspective, human life does not begin at conception. Life continues at conception. It's the ongoing transmission of a biological legacy that already exists within the parents and stretches back through countless generations. The living sperm and the living egg unite to perpetuate a stream of biological existence that has never been interrupted.
So I'm going to parrot this back to you. And I've read the book, so I think I understand this already. But you're saying that life is better understood as a continuous information stream rather than stop-start, a series of discrete events.
Exactly. Life is the transmission of intelligence, genetic code, if you will, through time. Each generation serves as both a recipient and a transmitter. This isn't just philosophy, it's observable biology. The fundamental purpose of life is communication across generations. When we ask, when does life begin, we're ignoring the fact that it's already flowing. Conception isn't creation ex nihilo. It's a continuation.
I love it when you use Latin words. I take umbrage to the idea that life is the transmission of intelligence because I've seen Congress work.
Well, there are exceptions to the rule.
Okay.
And it's like,
Okay. So, and this has profound implications for how we think about rights, doesn't it?
yes, it does. If life is continuous, then the rights associated with that human life must also be continuous. In other words, they precede fertilization because they're not created at some arbitrary milestone. They're inherited. Rights exist in potential in the parental gametes and become actualized in the new individual at fertilization. This completely reframes the timeline.
Well, I've never ever heard this posited in this way. So I think it's a fascinating new slant on an old argument. Now, one of the most powerful distinctions you make in the book is between natural persons and legal persons. Now, to me, that seems critical to your entire framework. So, can you please explain this for our audience?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, this is absolutely critical, Rob. A natural person is a human being whose rights are inherent. They exist by virtue of being human, not by government decree. These rights come from nature, from what we are as a species. They precede and transcend all institutions. A legal person, by contrast, is a construct created by governments for specific purposes, mainly commerce and governance. Corporations are legal persons. Municipalities are legal persons. They're granted specific, revocable rights and privileges by the state.
So, in effect, you're saying that the danger comes when we conflate the two or perhaps confuse them.
Precisely. The abortion strategy has been to frame the entire argument within legal definitions, asserting that a fetus isn't a person until born alive, quote unquote. Right? This effectively dehumanizes the unborn by denying them legal standing in a legal world. But here's the grave tactical error many anti abortion advocates make. They try to counter this by fighting to have the fetus recognized as a legal person. While, well intentioned, this strategy is catastrophic because it accepts the premise that personhood is something that the state has the authority to bestow. Once you concede that governments can grant personhood, you've also conceded that they can revoke it.
Which we'll get into in another podcast. The idea that
Yep.
personhood is mutable
Right, right.
and
Right.
that the government can take it away or grant it.
And that was a core observation that I made. And when I started looking back in history of all of the black spots on the history of mankind, it's always been this fight between me saying I'm a natural person and I have natural rights and someone else telling me that I'm not.
I'm going to agree that it can be a slippery slope. And it does, as I think back, it does have terrifying historical precedents.
Oh, there's no question. You're exactly right. Look at Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court declared that people of African descent weren't citizens and had no rights to which the white man was bound to respect. Nazi Germany's T4 project, where the state defined life unworthy of living. First the terminally ill, then the mentally disabled, then anyone deemed economically unproductive. When governments get the power to define who counts as human, no group is safe.
So the argument must be that the fetus is a natural person from the start, even before it starts, in fact.
Exactly.
With rights the law must recognize and not create.
Exactly.
Now, again, we're talking about the law here.
Exactly. That's absolutely correct.
So you're bringing the law back into play when you say that, though.
Exactly. But people have to realize that governments do not create rights. The role of a government is to recognize rights and discover them, not create them. All right. So that's the only philosophically consistent and strategically sound position for protecting human dignity long term. They have to recognize discoverable rights and not create.
Okay. Let me switch gears just a little bit. I read the book, and in it, you introduce a concept that I found compelling, particularly compelling. The concept was the placental barrier as a biological and moral boundary. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, the placental barrier is the definitive biological event that establishes the fetus as a separate organism from the mother. Once the placenta forms, the embryo has its own distinct circulatory system, its own genetic identity. It's no longer just traveling within the mother's body. It's a guest, if you will, but biologically separate. Okay?
So, as I'm hearing you say that, this directly challenges the my body, my choice argument.
Well, yeah, it demolishes it actually. But let's clarify this. A woman can decide to become pregnant or not become pregnant. She can make that decision. When she says my body, my choice, that's what the actual meaning of that was in the beginning. Now I want to be clear. A woman absolutely possesses unalienable natural rights over her own body. Bodily autonomy is fundamental, but those rights are limited by the point where they interfere with the equal rights of another distinct human organism. The assertion that abortion is solely about a woman's right over her own body is biologically false. The fetus is not part of her body, it's a separate organism with its own rights. A son or a daughter is not the mother. The principle of non interference applies equally to both. Maternal rights end where the placental barrier begins. This is not philosophy, it's biology drawing a bright line.
Now, I think you'd agree we have to recognize there are horrific choices that women sometimes have to make. And you, in the book, acknowledge tragic exceptions where the rights of the mother and the rights of the unborn child come into conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Natural law provides clear guidance. If a pregnancy directly threatens the mother's life, she has an absolute right to abort. That's self preservation, the most fundamental of all natural rights. In cases of rape, incest, or coercion, violations of her autonomy, she has what I would call a moral opportunity to terminate. Though I distinguish this from an absolute right because the fetus itself is innocent. Okay. But beyond these two narrow circumstances, the principle of personal responsibility applies.
All right, we're going to get into personal responsibility and exactly what that means in terms of natural law versus the legal definitions of law. But when I read the book, I found myself wondering about the premise. On the one hand, you're saying that conceptualized life has rights defined by natural law. And on the other, you are saying that the state really has no power to stop a woman from aborting because it's a very personal and heart-wrenching choice. In other words, the state shouldn't or can't prosecute what natural law might consider an immoral act. So I guess what I'm really getting at is while your argument seems very pro-life, you're not calling for state protection of the fetus. It looks to me as if perhaps you're likely to piss off both sides of the argument, pro-life and pro-choice. In effect, you're calling them both numbskulls. But here's my question. If the state's primary function is to recognize and protect our humanity, our unalienable rights, as it were, then it follows that the state should defend everyone's unalienable rights under natural law. But you're still giving the mother the choice to abort in the case of an abortion for convenience only, even though in most cases she does not have that right under natural law to end her pregnancy. So that argument to me seems a slippery slope too. I think what you're saying is that government enforcement, forcing the woman to comply with the moral mandate under natural law not to abort, is equally as harmful. Am I getting that wrong? Where am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Let me put it to you this way. While the natural law framework establishes that the fetus is a natural person whose life has been unjustly ended in abortion, the solution is not to transform the state into an authoritarian enforcer of morality. The woman bears profound moral responsibility for her choice, but criminal prosecution, particularly murder charges, represents exactly the kind of government overreach that threatens liberty and has historically proved ineffective. The path forward requires constitutional recognition of fetal personhood and rights, elimination of state sanction and subsidy, and a cultural transformation achieved through reason and persuasion, not through turning women into criminals. I recognize the seeming contradiction. This does create a philosophical tension that critics might exploit. If the fetus truly possesses equal natural rights, why shouldn't its termination be treated legally as any other homicide? In my view, moral truth and optimal legal policy are not always identical. My position may not satisfy absolutists on either side, but it reflects a consistent commitment to natural law principles and limited government, even when those principles create uncomfortable tensions. My point is that setting a very low bar for state-sanctioned, on-demand abortion is a half step away from state enforcement of abortion. The PRC's one-child policy, or the Nazis' anti-natalist component of the Volksgemeinschaft project come to mind. They even took a stab at forced sterilization and licensure for pregnancy in our United States.
Can you pronounce this Volksgemeinschaft thing again?
Volksgemeinschaft project.
Okay, got it. I'll work on that. Right.
No, say it again. It almost sounds like something you hear in the Second World War.
Right. Well, I have trouble pronouncing Volkswagen. So.
Volksgemeinschaft. Yeah.
Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Why don't you give me some examples of intrusion into reproductive rights in the United States?
Oh, okay. But first, keep in mind the pattern. When the state claims authority to determine who counts as a person, it inevitably claims the authority to determine who does not. Okay? This is not an accidental byproduct of bad governance. It is a structural consequence of transferring the definition of personhood from nature to law. Once personhood becomes a legal status, rather than an inherent quality of being human, it becomes contingent, revocable, adjustable, and subject to political fashion. So here's an example: the American eugenics movement. This illustrates the point clearly. When states adopt compulsory sterilization laws, they did so under the premise that certain individuals were unfit and therefore less entitled to reproduce. The Supreme Court's decision in Buck versus Bell in 1927 did not merely authorize sterilization, it affirmed the state's power to rank human beings by worthiness. The moment the court accepted that some lives were less valuable, the door opened to coercive control over those lives. The state's definition of personhood became a tool of exclusion. 32 states enacted these laws. 32, okay? And there weren't 50 states in 1927, all right? So this is what you see. Now, these examples differ in scale and brutality. We're not talking about abortion here, but we're talking about the ability to reproduce. But they share a common philosophical root: the belief that personhood is a status conferred by the state rather than an inherent attribute of human nature. When governments define personhood, they do not merely describe reality, they reshape it. They create categories of humans who may be protected and categories who may be harmed with impunity. The state becomes the arbiter of who is owed moral consideration and who may be treated as a means to an end. This is where, in our US code, life became defined as those at birth, that life begins at birth. This is where it was defined because it eliminated all of the rights associated with human life during the fetal development. They have no rights under the law because they're not alive under the law. You get the point? So
I'm beginning to really, really understand this.
all right. This is why. This is precisely why grounding rights in natural law is essential. Natural personhood is not granted, it is recognized. It does not fluctuate with political winds or judicial interpretations. It is anchored in the biological reality of what a human being is, not in the preferences of those who hold power. The historical record shows that once personhood becomes a legal construct, it becomes a political instrument. And political instruments are always vulnerable to abuse. So, what is the lesson here? The stark lesson: the moment society allows the state to define who counts as a person, it simultaneously grants the state the power to define who does not. And history shows again and again that this power is eventually abused. All right.
Well,
Sorry, I didn't want to go off on a rant, but this is what this led me to investigate. I saw the pattern and I created the sovereign self as an answer to this because I realized that I had not made the point that this is not just about abortion. It plays into every single aspect of our lives. And the way to measure that has never been described. So,
all right, now you're getting ahead of the second podcast.
all right, okay. But in any case,
But
this was a kernel, and it became, how could I say this? It became seminal to my understanding of human history.
all right, so we're going to talk about that in the next podcast. But let me ask you one final question because we're about out of time. Was there a point in your life when something clicked and you said, I think I've got it?
Yes.
Can you tell me that story before we close?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, my U.S. passport expired. Now, I'm in Italy, and I am a legal permanent resident. I will never give up my U.S. citizenship for anything. I'm going to die with my U.S. citizenship. Even though I have a legal right to an Italian citizenship, I don't want it. But you see, the problem is that my paperwork here is all dependent upon a valid U.S. passport. I have permanent residency status, but it's based on the passport. So along comes a law that my paper identification in Italy, it's just an identification. Oh, here's my ID. My paper identification had to be converted into an electronic credit card size identification, electronic ID. So I go there with all of my Italian documentation, and the bureaucrat behind the window didn't see me as a human being. He saw me as a file error. He told me I needed my passport. I had to go back, get my passport, bring it in. It says, your passport is expired. Hey, questo passaporto è scaduto. And I looked at him, I said, yeah, sì, è scaduto. He said, well, in other words, I ceased being a human being to him. I was a file error. I was a technical error. So he was looking at me as a stateless individual, a stateless person. So I had to go through the entire process of of renewing my passport that I didn't realize had expired. It was expired maybe a few days. I didn't realize it because I never use it traveling around here. I have an internal Italian passport, but it was cartacea. It was made out of paper. It wasn't an electronic card. So I had to go through it. Thank God that the American government, the US government, was much more efficient than the Italian one is. And I was able to rectify the situation in a relatively short period of time through the consulate in Naples. They sent me a new passport, and all of a sudden I was reborn into the legal world in Italy. The guy didn't see me as Dr. Giordano. He didn't see me as the father of two children. He didn't see me as a healthcare practitioner who's been paying taxes, and doing everything that you would need to do in order to abide by the rules of society here. He didn't see me as that at all. He saw me as a stateless, faceless anomaly. And the guy never, ever even looked me in the eyes. So what it did was it
for
brought,
want a passport, you would not have written these books.
well, it stimulated me to write the second book. But what it did was, in that particular moment, it brought back a lot of memories of discussions that I had with my father on this very subject.
In the book Unalienable.
No, the book Unalienable, we didn't really touch on this. We did in a little way, but then it brought back another series of conversations that I had with my father in the discussion of the difference between a legal person and a natural person that started when I was about 15, 16 years old. And it completely slipped my mind. I mean, I knew I had an inherent knowledge of it, but it was brought back with crystal clarity when I stepped in front of that bureaucrat behind a sportello. I told this guy in Italian, I said, yeah, the passport is expired, but I'm not. And he looked at me like I was crazy.
All right. Well, Dr. Tom, I think we're out of time here. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about how your framing abortion and natural law led you to discover and then write the book, The Sovereign Self. Am I correct?
Right. What I realized is that we needed a methodology to measure respect for human personhood in order to see when your personhood is being eroded. And believe me, once I did a search through history, starting with the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans and Christianity and the Enlightenment, I started to see patterns of denial that were being fought against, that were always under the surface of this struggle between recognition and denial of human personhood. And I found that to be the basis of all of man's inhumanity to man that makes history.
Well, I'm looking forward to this next podcast, and I hope we can do that again in a day or so, and we'll put that up as well. How about that?
Yeah, it's fine.
And until we talk again, we're going to say thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.